A sharp knock cut through the howling wind outside, an unnatural sound against the frozen silence of the wilderness. Inside the small wooden shelter, Nyla's gaze snapped toward the door. No one ventured this far into the icy wasteland, not unless they were lost, desperate, or dangerous. She preferred to assume the latter. The knock came again, fainter this time. A dying man then. With a sharp exhale, Nyla slid her knife into the sheath at her thigh before unbolting the door. A rush of frigid air slammed into her, sending a chill through the dimly lit space. Her eyes locked onto the figure swaying at the threshold, a man human, tall and broad-shouldered. His flight suit was torn, caked in ice, and his short dark hair was stiff with frost. His face was pale, his lips nearly blue. He barely managed to stay on his feet, but his sharp eyes lifted to meet hers. "Help me," he rasped. Nyla didn't move. A human. It had been years since she'd seen one up close. Her people despised them. She had every reason to shut the door and let the cold finish what it had started. And yet she stepped back. Inside. Now. The man staggered past her and collapsed onto the wooden floor. Nyla shut the door with a firm click, sealing out the blizzard. She turned, arms crossed, watching him shake uncontrollably, breath ragged. He reeked of smoke, his ship must have crashed. That explained why he was here. What it didn't explain was why she was letting him stay. "Take that frozen suit off before it kills you," she ordered. The man lifted his ice-blue eyes toward her, wary but assessing. "You always this welcoming?" he muttered through chattering teeth. Nyla arched an eyebrow. "Would you rather I throw you back outside?" He let out a hoarse chuckle, then, with slow, stiff movements, unzipped the damaged flight suit and peeled it off. Nyla turned away, grabbed a thick fur-lined blanket and tossed it at him. "Sit by the fire. You'll warm up faster." The human wrapped himself in the blanket and inched closer to the crackling flames. "Name's Rail," he said, his voice steadier now. Nyla didn't respond. Rail sighed, shaking his head slightly. "Not big on conversation, huh?" "I don't see the point." He smirked. "Then what do I call you? Ice Queen?" Nyla's expression didn't change. "Nyla." Rail's grin deepened. "Nice to meet you, Nyla." She rolled her eyes and turned away, filling a metal cup with steaming water from the pot over the fire. Without a word, she handed it to him. Their fingers brushed briefly. His skin was warming, the cold no longer draining his strength. Nyla watched him from the corner of her eye. She knew better than to trust a human. But it was too late for that now. Rail sat close to the fire, the blanket still draped over his shoulders. His shivering had lessened, but the occasional tremor still ran through him. Across from him, Nyla sharpened a curved blade, her slow, deliberate movements filling the cabin with the rhythmic scrape of metal against stone. A silent warning. She wasn't lowering her guard. Rail rolled his sore shoulder. "So, is this the part where you interrogate me?" Nyla didn't look up. "If I wanted answers, I wouldn't need to ask." He raised an eyebrow. "That's supposed to scare me?" She smirked. "It should." Rail stretched out, adjusting the blanket. "I crashed by accident, if that's what you're wondering. Wasn't exactly aiming to land in the middle of an ice storm." Nyla glanced at him then. "And your ship?" He exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Burned up on impact. Nothing left but wreckage." She nodded once as if she already knew the answer. "And your people?" His jaw tightened slightly. "They're not coming." She tilted her head. "You sound certain?" Rail shrugged, masking whatever emotion flickered behind his tired eyes. "They don't waste resources on lost causes." Nyla studied him a moment longer before sheathing her blade. Then she turned, moving to a metal storage chest against the far wall. She rummaged through the supplies before tossing a bundle of thick, dark clothing onto the table. "Put that on," she ordered. "Your suit's worthless, and I don't need you freezing to death under my roof." Rail eyed the clothes, a fur-lined shirt and heavy reinforced pants. He let out a low chuckle. "Didn't take you for the generous type." She shot him a sharp look. "It's not generosity. It's survival. If you die, you become my problem." Rail smirked. "Sounds like I'm already a problem. Just get dressed, human." Rail took his time pulling on the new clothes. They fit surprisingly well, though the fabric carried a faint scent, leather and something unmistakably hers. Nyla turned away, giving him space, but he noticed the way her shoulders remained tense, as if she expected him to turn into a threat at any moment. When he was finished, he exhaled. "All right. Now what?" Nyla crossed her arms. "Now we set the rules." Rail raised an eyebrow. "Rules? This is my cabin. I built it. I protect it. That means you do what I say." He chuckled. Not much of a democracy. She arched a brow. Do you see a council here? Fair point. She stepped closer, her presence commanding despite her smaller frame. If you expect to stay, you work. Hunting. Chopping wood. Keeping this place livable. You sure you want me near your weapons? If you become a problem, I'll handle it. Her confidence was unwavering. He tilted his head. Anything else, boss? Nyla ignored the mock title. Instead, she walked to the window, staring out at the swirling snow. It drops below freezing at night, she said, voice calm but firm. Even with the fire, it won't be enough. Rail leaned against the table. What are you saying? She turned back, expression unreadable. We share body heat. Silence. Rail blinked. Come again? Nyla's stance remained firm, as if she were discussing rations. The cold is lethal. I'm not letting you die under my roof. Rail exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. That's pragmatic. It's survival. Rail studied her carefully, searching for any sign that this was a joke. But Nyla wasn't the type. She was dead serious. Still, he couldn't resist teasing. You always this hospitable? You're the first human I haven't shot on sight. Rail chuckled. I feel special. Nyla ignored him, pulling back the heavy furs on the single bed. Then she glanced at him expectantly. Well? Rail shook his head, amused. You really know how to set the mood. Her patience thinned. Get in or sleep on the floor and die. Your choice. He smirked. When you put it like that. He slid onto the bed. The mattress was firm but warm from the fire's heat. Nyla climbed in beside him, movements precise, controlled. She kept a safe distance. Still, he could feel the tension in the air. Rail grinned. You look thrilled? Nyla exhaled slowly. Shut up and sleep, human. Rail chuckled but obeyed. Tonight at least he would live. The heavy wooden door creaked as Nyla cracked it open, one hand still gripping the knife at her side. The freezing wind howled through the narrow gap, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else. Something metallic, something familiar. The figure standing outside was shrouded in dark furs, his face mostly hidden beneath a thick hood. But even before he pushed the hood back, revealing the sharp, weathered features beneath, Nyla already knew who it was. Rogan. Carl, still standing near the fire, watched her tense at the sight of the man. He didn't know much about her past yet, but this reaction told him plenty. The man's dark eyes flicked past Nyla, landing on Carl with cold calculation. Didn't think I'd find you with company, Rogan murmured, stepping forward. Nyla didn't move. You shouldn't have come. Carl leaned against the table, arms crossed. I take it you two know each other? Rogan smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. You could say that. His gaze snapped back to Nyla. You've been busy, I see. Nyla finally stepped aside, just enough to let him in before slamming the door shut behind him. The warmth of the cabin did nothing to soften the tension crackling between them. What do you want, Rogan? She asked, her voice low and edged with warning. Rogan didn't answer right away. He unfastened his heavy coat, shaking off the clinging frost before tossing it over a chair. His movements were slow, deliberate. Testing the waters. Carl didn't like it. He could recognize the way a soldier sized up a room, how Rogan's eyes flickered from the door to the weapons in the corner to the knife still gripped in Nyla's hand. Finally, Rogan exhaled, his breath visible in the chilly air. I came to warn you. Nyla stiffened. About what? They know where you are. Carl exchanged a look with her. I'm guessing they isn't a friendly group? Rogan shook his head. Your little stunt back then, refusing orders, going rogue, it didn't just make you an outcast, Nyla. It made you a target. And now they're done looking the other way. Nyla's jaw tightened. How many? Rogan hesitated, but only for a second. A squad. Maybe more. They want you dead. Carl let out a slow breath. So just to recap, you're some kind of fugitive, your own people want you dead, and now a squad of heavily armed soldiers is on their way to finish the job? Nyla shot him a glare. This isn't your problem. Carl snorted. Funny, considering I just got nearly skewered by one of your people outside. He turned his gaze to Rogan. And what about you? Are you here to help or just to deliver the bad news? Rogan leaned against the table, crossing his arms. Depends. Nyla's fingers tightened around the handle of her blade. On what? Rogan's expression was unreadable. On whether or not you're ready to stop running? Silence settled between them, heavy and suffocating. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it did nothing to warm the chill creeping into the room. Carl finally exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Great. Just great. So we've got incoming assassins, limited supplies, and a blizzard outside. He glanced at Nyla. Tell me you've got a plan, boss? Nyla inhaled sharply, then nodded once. We fight. Carl blinked. That's the plan? Just we fight? Unless you have a better idea. Carl sighed. I was kind of hoping for an option that didn't involve me getting shot at. Rogan chuckled. You picked the wrong woman to shack up with, friend. Carl threw up his hands. Look, I didn't exactly have a choice. She basically dragged me in here, told me to share a bed for warmth, and threatened to kill me if I annoyed her too much. Rogan arched a brow. So, a typical Nyla hospitality experience? Nyla rolled her eyes. We don't have time for this. If they're close, we need to prepare. She turned to Carl. You still have that axe? Carl patted the handle strapped to his belt. Not exactly a gun, but yeah. It'll do. She turned back to Rogan. If you're really here to help, I need to know something. Rogan tilted his head. And what's that? Nyla stepped closer, her green eyes flashing. Will you fight with me, or against me? For a long moment, Rogan didn't answer. Then, slowly, a grin spread across his face. Let's make them regret coming here. Carl groaned. I swear if I die on this frozen rock because of your past drama, I'm haunting you both. Nyla smirked. Get in line. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the storm closer. And with it death. Chapter 3, Preparing for War. The storm outside raged harder, thick sheets of snow battering the cabin walls. It was the kind of cold that turned breath into ice and stole the feeling from fingers within seconds. But inside, the heat of the fire wasn't the only thing warming the air. Tension burned just as fiercely. Carl adjusted his grip on the axe, rolling his shoulders as he watched Nyla and Rogan exchange silent looks. The unspoken history between them was obvious, layered in old scars and words left unsaid. Carl had no idea whether Rogan was really here to help or if he had his own agenda, but Nyla hadn't stabbed him yet, so that was something. So, Carl finally said, breaking the silence. How exactly are we supposed to fight off a squad of trained killers with one axe, a few knives, and a rapidly dwindling patience for this weather? Nyla shot him a look. You'd rather wait for them to come knocking? Carl let out a dry chuckle. Not particularly. Just wondering if we have anything resembling a plan. Rogan leaned against the table, arms crossed, his expression calm despite the situation. They won't attack until the storm dies down. Visibility is too low even for them. That gives us a few hours. Nyla nodded, already moving toward a wooden chest against the far wall. She flipped open the lid, revealing a stash of weapons inside. Not many, but enough. 2 curved blades, a compact pulse pistol, and a handful of throwing knives. She pulled out the pistol and checked the charge. Not much power left, she muttered. Carl arched a brow. You've had a gun this whole time and didn't mention it? She gave him a flat look. Didn't think you needed to know. Carl exhaled, muttering something under his breath before turning to Rogan. So what's their strategy? Kick the door in and shoot us full of holes? Rogan shook his head. If they wanted you dead immediately, you wouldn't have seen the scout. They're probing first, testing defenses. When they do move in, it'll be quiet. A few of them will try to slip in unnoticed while the others set up an ambush outside, cutting off any escape routes. Carl frowned. Great. Love that for us. Nyla grabbed a knife and tossed it at him. He caught it, barely. Better than being unarmed, she said. Carl eyed the blade, then looked back at her. You do realize I'm not exactly trained for this, right? Then learn fast, she replied, grabbing a bundle of thick rope from a shelf. She turned to Rogan. We reinforce the cabin. Set traps outside. Make it a nightmare for them to get close. Rogan smirked. Now that sounds like the Nyla I remember. Carl narrowed his eyes. Yeah, about that. What exactly was your relationship? Nyla hesitated just a fraction of a second before responding. We worked together. Rogan let out a short laugh. Work together is one way to put it. Carl pointed at him. See? That right there? That's the kind of comment that needs elaboration. Later, Nyla cut in, already moving toward the door. She grabbed a fur-lined cloak and pulled it on. Right now we need to work. Rogan grabbed his coat as well. I'll set up tripwires around the perimeter. If they try to sneak up, we'll know. Carl sighed, pulling on his gloves. Guess that leaves me on axe duty again. Nyla didn't bother answering, she was already out the door, disappearing into the storm. Carl ran a hand through his hair and exhaled. Yup. Definitely going to die on this frozen rock. Then he followed her into the cold. An hour later. The wind had calmed slightly, but the cold remained relentless. Carl's fingers were numb despite the gloves as he stacked the last of the sharpened stakes around the cabin's perimeter. Between that, the reinforced barricades on the windows and the tripwires Rogan had set up, they had done everything they could to make an ambush difficult. Nyla stood near the tree line, scanning the horizon. Her breath came in slow, measured exhales, her muscles poised for movement at a moment's notice. Even in the freezing cold, she didn't waver. Carl came up beside her, rubbing his hands together. "So we're ready?" "As ready as we can be." He glanced at her. "You really think we can take them?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to face him, her green eyes sharp as ever. "If we don't, we die. Simple as that." Carl let out a low whistle. "Wow. Love the optimism." She smirked slightly. "Just making sure you understand the stakes." Before Carl could respond, Rogan's voice cut through the air. "They're here." Carl tensed, gripping the axe as he turned. A row of dark figures had appeared in the distance, moving through the storm like shadows. The fight was coming. And there was no turning back now. The first sign of trouble wasn't the figures in the snow, it was the sudden silence. The wind, which had howled relentlessly all night, dipped into an eerie stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Carl felt his grip tighten on the axe as he stood next to Nyla outside the cabin. Rogan was crouched near the treeline, eyes locked on the approaching figures. "How many?" Nyla asked, her voice calm but edged with tension. "At least 6, Rogan muttered. "Maybe more, depending on how many are flanking." Carl exhaled. "And you're sure we can't just talk this out?" Nyla shot him a look. "They aren't here to talk." "Figured," Carl muttered, rolling his shoulders. "Had to ask." The figures moved with precision, spreading out as they drew closer. Their dark armor blended into the swirling snow, and Carl caught the gleam of weapons strapped to their sides. These weren't scouts. This was an execution squad. Rogan straightened, unsheathing one of his knives. "They'll try to force us into the cabin. Trap us inside where they control the fight. Then we don't let them," Nyla said. She reached into her belt and pulled out the compact pulse pistol, checking the charge one last time before shoving it back. "We make them fight on our terms?" Carl sighed, hoisting the axe over his shoulder. "Oh yeah, because 3 against 6 is such a solid plan." "You still have time to run," Nyla said, glancing at him. Carl let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, no offense, but I've seen what's out there. I like my chances better here." Rogan smirked. "Smart man." The squad was close now, their leader stepping forward. Unlike the others, his armor was reinforced with heavier plating, the dark green insignia on his chest marking him as high-ranking. When he spoke, his voice carried easily over the cold air. "Nyla Karen." Nyla didn't move. "You came all this way just to say my name?" The leader's lips curled slightly. "You know why we're here. There's nowhere left to run. Surrender and we'll make this painless." Carl leaned toward her. "This is usually where you tell them to go screw themselves, right?" Nyla didn't disappoint. "If I were going to surrender, I wouldn't have made you work for it." The leader sighed, shaking his head as if disappointed. "So be it." Then he raised his hand. The moment he did, the first shot rang out. Everything happened at once. A streak of blue energy sliced through the air as Rogan fired the pulse pistol first, striking one of the soldiers in the shoulder. The man staggered back, but before he could recover, Nyla was already moving, her knife flashing as she lunged. Carl barely had time to react before another soldier was rushing him. He ducked on instinct, the swing of a blade slicing through the air where his head had been a second ago. "Okay, no problem," Carl muttered to himself. "Just fight the deadly alien assassins. Totally fine." He swung the axe in a wide arc. The soldier dodged, but Carl followed through, kicking him hard in the gut. The man stumbled back, and Carl took the opening to bring the axe down again, catching him across the leg. The soldier went down, but Carl didn't have time to celebrate. Another was already charging. Meanwhile, Nyla was a blur of movement, weaving between attacks with deadly precision. One soldier lunged at her, but she caught his wrist mid-strike, twisting until the bones snapped. Before he could even scream, she slammed her knife into his side and shoved him away, already turning to the next. Rogan was just as fast, using the terrain to his advantage. He disappeared into the trees, moving like a shadow. A second later, one of the soldiers let out a strangled gasp as Rogan's blade found his throat. But for every enemy they took down, more pressed forward. Carl barely dodged a strike to his ribs, stumbling back. Could really use a gun right now? Nyla didn't answer. She was locked in combat with the squad leader, their blades clashing in rapid succession. He was good, fast, strong, and relentless. But Nyla was better. She ducked low, sweeping his legs out from under him. For a second it looked like she had him. Then the butt of a rifle slammed into her stomach. She gasped, staggering back. Carl saw it happen. Nyla? But he had his own problem. The soldier in front of him took advantage of his distraction, swinging hard. Carl managed to deflect the blow with the axe, but he wasn't fast enough to dodge the follow-up. A fist connected with his jaw. His vision blurred. He hit the snow hard, the cold seeping through his clothes instantly. He shook his head, trying to clear it, but the soldier was already raising his weapon for the killing blow. A gunshot cracked through the air. Carl blinked. The soldier in front of him staggered, a hole burning through his chest. Carl turned his head. Nyla stood a few feet away, breathing hard, smoke curling from the barrel of the pulse pistol in her hands. "Get up," she ordered. Carl groaned, pushing himself upright. "Remind me never to piss you off." The squad leader was on his feet again, blood dripping from his lip. His remaining men were falling back, realizing they had underestimated their targets. He scowled, eyes locking onto Nyla. "This isn't over." Then, with a sharp signal, the soldiers retreated into the storm. Carl let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Well, that was fun." Nyla didn't respond. She was staring after the retreating soldiers, her expression unreadable. Rogan wiped his blade clean. "They'll regroup. Come back stronger." "Yeah," Carl muttered, rubbing his bruised jaw. "Figured." Nyla finally turned to face them. "We don't wait for them to attack again," she said. "Next time we take the fight to them." Carl raised an eyebrow. "You mean, go after them on purpose?" Nyla's gaze was steady. "We end this before they get the chance." Carl sighed, shaking his head. "Of course. Why wouldn't we do the most dangerous possible thing?" But as he looked at Nyla, her determined stance, the fire in her eyes, he already knew his answer. He wasn't leaving. Not now. Not when the real fight was just beginning. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the scent of blood and burnt ozone. The battle had been brief but brutal, and now, as Carl stood beside Nyla and Rogan, he could see the enemy regrouping on the ridge. They wouldn't retreat this time. They were here to finish this. "We can't fight them all," Carl muttered, gripping his axe. "We don't have to," Nyla said. "We just need to end it." She was right. They were outnumbered, but they weren't outmatched. Nyla had spent years running, but this was where it stopped. "How?" Rogan asked. His knife was slick with blood, his breath fogging in the freezing air. Nyla exhaled, her decision already made. "We lure them to the ravine. Make them chase us." Carl frowned. "And then what?" She turned to him, her green eyes steady. "We bring the mountain down on them." The final stand. They ran. Through the frozen forest, through the waist-deep snow, with the enemy closing fast behind them. Energy blasts whizzed past, lighting up the darkness. Carl's heart pounded as he leapt over a fallen log, barely dodging a strike from the soldier on his heels. He swung his axe without thinking, catching the man in the arm before pushing forward. Ahead he saw it, the ravine. A jagged wound in the earth, its frozen edges sharp as knives. It was deep, too deep to survive a fall, and the unstable cliffside above it was their only chance. "Keep going," Nyla shouted. Rogan was already there, setting the charges they'd salvaged from the enemy's fallen. Nyla skidded to a stop beside him, pulling out the detonator. The enemy wasn't far behind. The squad leader was at the front, fury in his eyes. "You can't run from this, Karen." Nyla didn't move. "I'm not running." Carl barely had time to brace before she pressed the trigger. Boom. The world shook. The mountainside roared as the ice cracked, the rock beneath giving way in a violent cascade. Snow and debris collapsed in an instant, swallowing the enemy whole. The soldiers had no time to react. One moment they were charging forward, the next they were gone, lost beneath tons of ice and stone. The ground trembled, the echoes of the avalanche fading into silence. Then, nothing. Carl didn't breathe. He stared at the wreckage, the place where the enemy had been. Buried. Gone. It was over. The end of the road. The three of them stood in the snow, exhaustion settling in. The sky above was clearing, the storm breaking at last. Rogan let out a low whistle. "Remind me never to doubt you again." Carl exhaled, leaning on his axe. "So, that's it? No more assassins? No more fighting for our lives?" Nyla was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "It's over." Carl turned to her. "Then what now?" She hesitated. For so long she had been on the run, always looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next fight. But now she was free. She met Carl's gaze, and for the first time, there was something soft in her expression. We start over? Carl raised an eyebrow. You mean like, settle down? Farm life? He grinned. Because I gotta say, I don't think you're exactly the homesteading type. She smirked. Maybe. But I could get used to a place where I don't have to sleep with a weapon under my pillow. Carl pretended to think. Well, there is plenty of space in that cabin. Rogan rolled his eyes. If you two are done flirting, we should probably get moving before another storm rolls in. Carl grinned but didn't take his eyes off Nyla. So, we're really doing this? She nodded. Yeah, we are. Carl exhaled, looking out over the ruined battlefield, the sky clearing above them. For the first time in a long time he wasn't running. He wasn't surviving. He was living. And maybe, just maybe, this was home. The end.